Thank you for coming tonight. I would like to welcome especially the family of Tony Calvó-Armengol, who are joining us today, and also all the colleagues of the Barcelona Graduate School of Economics and the people that attended the workshop that Melissa organized. So just a brief note to remember a little bit what are we doing today. The Calvó-Armengol International Prize was created to keep alive the memory of one of the best, yet most promising academics of the Barcelona Graduate School of Economics, that was a professor at the Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona, and who was also one of the best scientists in Andorra's history, Antoni Calvó-Armengol. Three institutions, the government of Andorra, Fundació Crèdit Andorrà, and the Barcelona GSE, coordinated efforts to create an international prize in honor of our friend Tony. The aim was to design a prize that would reflect Tony's profile, a young scientist with much energy and creativity, academic rigor, international recognition, and also socially committed. The prize links Tony's name to these traits that we recognize and we want to preserve forever. These are actually characteristics shared by the 5 awardees of the Calvó-Armengol Prize. Professor Esther Duflo, the first edition awarded in 2010. Professor Roland Fryer in 2012, second edition. Professor Raj Chetty in 2014. Professor Matthew Gensko in the 4th edition in 2016. And today we have Professor Melissa Dell from Harvard University in our 5th edition of this prize. I want to thank the Governor of Andorra and Fundació Crèdit Andorrà for its involvement in sharing the goals, profile, and commitment of the prize. Together, we have succeeded in consolidating a prize that is internationally recognized and coveted by excellent young scholars and scientists. I would also like to thank the work of the award jury, chaired by Professor Matthew Jackson, and composed also by Professor Salvador Barberá, who is with us today, and Professor Esther Duflo, that, as you know, was the first awardee of the prize. The quality of the winners selected in the 5 editions and its harmony with the values of excellence and commitment that we aim to stand out prove the excellence of the work of this jury. I would also like to thank the work of our Deputy Director for Research at the Barcelona GSE, Julian Di Giovanni, who was coordinating the award on its 5th edition, and all those people who have worked to make possible the official ceremony that we had yesterday in Andorra, the academic workshop conference that's taking place today and tomorrow, and today's lecture for the Calvó-Armengol lecture. Finally, I would like to congratulate Professor Melissa Dell for being awarded the Calvó-Armengol Prize, a recognition highly deserved for her research. The work of Professor Dell is not only a great contribution to the frontier of knowledge, but also shows the enormous potential of research in social sciences to understand many aspects of social, economic, and political outcomes. That is what Tony's research was, and that is what we want to remember and recognize. Many thanks, Professor Dell, for being here with us today. I'm going to just let the word to Salvador Barberá, who will actually do a profile of the Professor Dell. Thank you very much.
Yeah, on behalf of the jury, let me read a little bit what we wrote on the occasion of the award. Melissa Dell was at the Society of Fellows at Harvard University from 2012 to 2014, before joining the Department of Economics at Harvard in 2014. She received her PhD from MIT, an MPhil from Oxford, and her BA from Harvard, all in economics. Melissa was a Rhodes Scholar and a Sloan Fellow. Despite her young age, her research is already considered path-breaking in illuminating how political institutions function. Her work combines historical data with clever means of identifying causal patterns seeing what leads political and social systems to function well or poorly. Her contributions range from showing how political changes in Mexico impacted drug wars and network patterns of trade, to a variety of studies detailing how weather patterns and temperatures affect economic productivity. One of Dell's most well-known studies examined how a forced labor system from centuries ago has had lasting effects on political and social institutions and still affects household consumption and well-being today. Melissa examined a forced labor mining system in Peru and showed how it affected land ownership systems and public good provisions, and how that persisted over time to affect communities' welfare today. Among her newest research is a study of how different military strategies by the US in the Vietnam War had a lasting impact on institutions in the area. The research uses randomness in an algorithm that the US used to select bombing targets to see how areas that were bombed were differently impacted, finding that it increased communist insurgency, reduced non-communist activity, and weakened the local governance structure. Also, using a geographic border between different military strategies, Melissa was able to see how differently two strategies worked. One involved local intervention and investment, and the other involved increasing military activity. The hearts and minds approach resulted in improved attitudes and lessened attacks against US forces compared to the more power-based approach. This highly original and important research provides very careful research documenting how military strategies affect the population's perception and attitudes. Melissa Dell's research showcases an impressive ability to use historical data to understand the functioning of a variety of economic, social, and political systems, and she's most deserving of the prize. That was the statement that we prepared at the time. Just to close, let me say that because this is already the 5th edition, I went back to some of the words that I had the opportunity to say when the award was first presented in public. And I translated it from Catalan, so it may not be a big deal of a text, but they are very heartfelt. So I would like to read a few of these words to help those of you who did not meet Tony to understand why he was and still is such an important presence for us, and why we are so thankful also to the recipients of the prize for helping us to honor his memory. These are the words. To me, Tony was the wind that carries new sounds and scents from far away. The wind that makes us move ahead and to fly higher. The wind that shakes our foundations and tests their strength. The wind that cleans the fields and opens new paths. The wind that announces that times are changing. The wind that brought us many seeds, but could not wait to see them mature. And now, without wind, who will blow into the sails of our boat? We'll have to row hard again, all together. And our joint efforts will be gratified every 2 years by the presence of a young researcher who will bring back to us some of the fresh wind that we'll always be missing. That's what I wrote, and that's how I feel today. Thank you.
Melissa, the floor is yours. And Salvador and I will move down so we can follow.
Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. It's an incredible honor for me to be here. I am a longtime, huge fan of Tony's work, and to receive a prize in his honor is just an enormous honor to me. So, first of all, thank you. Today, I'm going to be talking about the topic of the conference, which is persistence and transformation in economic development. And so, research on the persistent reasons why some places remain poor, other places become rich, has played a major role in economics over the past 15 years in particular. And it's inspired the integration of modern empirical methods into economic history, and it's helped the field of economics to move beyond its traditional roots of focusing largely on the US and Europe. And insights from this literature have also the potential to inform policy decisions outside just academia. By understanding why the world is the way it is today, that has the potential to help us make more informed decisions. Okay, so I wanted to start with a quote from Bob Solow, who's one of the founders of modern economics. And he said that the part of economics that is independent of history and social context is not only very small, but also very dull. So we'll be talking today a lot about broader social context. Hopefully that helps to make this lecture less dull. Okay, so in particular, I'm going to discuss some insights that have been gleaned over the past decades about the role of persistence in economic development, and I'm going to illustrate those using some examples from my research. And then at the end, I'm going to talk a little bit more about promising future research directions. We have a lot of young researchers here at this conference who will be determining the direction that the field goes in the coming years. And I want to talk a little bit about some potential advances that I'm most excited about. Okay, but first I just want to provide a little bit of intellectual history to put the rest of this talk in broader perspective. So if you go back to the 1940s and the early 1950s, development economics, thinking about why some countries are persistently poor, how structural transformation happens, that was a central part of economics. And the writings in this genre were very rich in their institutional details and in their historical knowledge, but typically they didn't use formal modeling, they weren't disciplined by using data, and by the 1960s, economics journals basically wouldn't publish anything that wasn't disciplined by a formal model, and because a lot of these issues are ones that are challenging to look at in this way, development economics, economic history, moved outwards towards the fringes of the economic mainstream. Most models of economic growth were based on economic growth as we see it in the US, growing at 2% a year in perpetuity. And in these growth models, there was a single long-run steady state. Everyone would ultimately converge to that same level of development, and history was irrelevant in these models. So I think in the minds of a lot of economists, if you go back to the early 1990s, they didn't particularly think that history was relevant, didn't come into our models. Development practitioners, following Solow's famous model, largely emphasized accumulating physical and later human capital. Economic historians were mostly focusing on the US and Europe. But along with the resurgence of development economics in the 1990s and 2000s also came a growing interest in the role that historical forces play in economic development. And so I'll give one example of a particularly seminal paper in this literature to give people who aren't familiar a flavor for it. So there's a highly influential paper by Asamoah, Johnson, and Robinson that documents an interesting fact, which is places that were likely the richest in 1500 are the poorest places today. And this is particularly true when you look within places that became colonies. And so their interpretation of this fact is that colonizers went to the richest places and set up extractive institutions to exploit those riches. And those extractive institutions in turn persisted and lower economic development in the long run. So this is just a picture of their result. Places that were more urbanized on the x-axis, we think that they were richer in 1500, but they're actually poorer today. The vertical axis shows GDP per capita. And so this is actually very interesting in that sometimes this persistence literature, people say, oh, you say the world's deterministic and something happens a long time ago and then that just determines your level of income forever. And this is actually showing a more sort of complex set of dynamics where it's the places that were more ahead in 1500 that actually ended up being poorer today. And so I like to think of Paul Krugman's African maps analogy, which he uses to think about kind of why development economics for a time was not central to mainstream economics. And he shows this map from the 1550s of Africa, and it's all, you know, very detailed and filled in, but a lot of it's not based on empirics or science. I think there's some, you know, monsters, etc. And that this was just people's perceptions. They thought they knew what Africa looked like, but actually they didn't. Once they knew enough to know what they knew and didn't know, you know, much of the map appears empty in the middle, and then slowly over time gets filled in. And I think that that's where we are in terms of thinking about, you know, the underlying deeper reasons for economic development, still in the process of doing research that's helping us to better understand that. Yep, so I want to talk a little bit about some insights from the past decade. In particular, I want to illustrate two important points that have been made more broadly in the literature, but I want to give examples of them from my research. So the first point is that understanding the channels of persistence is important. What are the reasons why these historical events or institutions matter? And the second point is that informal norms can be highly relevant to persistence. So it's not just about things that are formal and written down like constitutions, etc. Informal local norms of behavior can be very persistent and very important to understanding economic development. Okay. So first, to talk about why, and to illustrate an example of how the channels of persistence matter. So you can look at historical events or institutions that at first glance appear very similar, and yet they have quite distinct long-run effects. So one reaction to this might be, well, you just can't generalize. You know, maybe anthropologists have it right that we should study each example independently and not try to make generalizations. But I think that that's not that's not the case. Rather, it's important to consider the transmission mechanisms, which are what's going to determine the long-run effects, which suggests moving beyond an emphasis on the so-called historical treatments, i.e. extractive institutions, and towards an examination of which intervening variables matter. So I'm going to illustrate this with two different examples of extractive colonial institutions, which were part of what inspired this kind of whole literature in the first place. I'm going to look at the Peruvian mita, which was forced mining labor in colonial Peru, and I'm going to look at the cultivation system in Java, which was forced labor in sugar production in colonial Java. The latter is joint work with Ben Olken at MIT. So by way of background, the mita was a forced labor draft in historical Peru and Bolivia that was enforced for about 240 years, starting in the 1570s. And it forced indigenous communities to send part of their male population to work in the mines in Potosi. When you hear about Spain bringing back large amounts of silver from the New World, most of that silver is coming from Potosi. And in particular, the mita subjected all the indigenous villages that are within this contiguous area here, so within the black boundary. And you can see from this map that most of the boundary is following the Andean range. We wouldn't necessarily want to compare across that part of the boundary, because not only did places inside have the mita and places outside didn't, but there's also a change in elevation and a change in other things at that boundary. So I'm going to focus on the portion of the boundary in white. That's the portion that cuts across the Andean range. And so if you look at geography and at things that we can observe beforehand, they look very similar. We think it's plausible that the main thing that differs across that portion of the boundary is just whether or not communities had to contribute to this forced labor draft for over 200 years. So the basic idea is just going to be comparing places just inside and just outside that boundary and to see how they look different across time. So I'm going to ask, does the mita exert long-run impacts on economic outcomes? And if so, what are the channels through which it matters? And I'm going to focus in particular on land tenure and public goods provision. And so this is a figure where the dots show household consumption taken from a survey of households, and then the background I'm just fitting like a smooth polynomial. So you can think of that as summarizing what the data is saying. You can see that inside those two green lines, which is the places subjected to the mita, it's showing a darker color, which means, according to the legend, that those places are poorer today. So if you move just inside this boundary, households today consume less. And we can also see this in data on children's heights. So children are shorter in the areas that were subjected to the mita. And this is a region where there's a lot of stunting. Children are shorter than they should be because they don't have enough nutrition. And again, you can see this sharp discontinuity at the green boundary. So you just go just inside the area where the mita was in force, and the people are poor, the children are more likely to have stunted growth. And I'm going to focus on land tenure as an important reason that explains this fact. So the mita was instituted soon after the Spanish showed up in Peru, before there was a landed elite. There's several reasons why we would expect the mita to affect land tenure, but the most important one that I want to highlight is that the Spanish colonial government didn't want competition for labor. So if I own a large hacienda and the government shows up and they want to take my attached laborers and use them to mine silver, that's going to be bad for me because I lose my labor, and I'll probably try to resist that. And the Spanish government appreciated this, and so they allowed Spanish settlers to set up haciendas outside the mita areas, but they were not allowed to do that inside. So what we see with time is that in the non-mita districts, you have these large Spanish landowners come in the early 17th century. They set up their large estates, and land tenure remains, fairly stable throughout the next hundreds of years. Whereas in the mita districts, while the mita is enforced, there's communal land tenure. That's abolished when Peru gains independence, but it's not replaced with enforceable norms of private property. And so you see a lot of poorly defined property rights, conflict, instability over land because the property rights are never well defined, whereas outside it may be large landowners that own the land, but things are very stable. So this is showing haciendas in 1689. You can see inside the two green lines, there's almost no haciendas at all. That's what the dark dots signify, whereas they're all located outside. And this pattern persists until 1845 and persists until 1940. There's land reform in 1970 that basically equalizes the land distribution, but doesn't erase these effects. So you also see higher education inside historically, and you see more roads in the non-mita areas today. So basically the roads all get built to the areas that have the haciendas. I went and visited these places when I was writing this paper, and the income differences are very evident. I asked people, well, why are those places over there poor? And their response was like, well, they got more roads from the government back in the 1940s when all the roads were being built. We don't particularly know why, but they got all the roads. We grow corn. We could grow more corn and take it to the market and sell it, except we don't have roads. So we have no way to get our agricultural output to market, so why would we ever grow more? And that's what you see here, that that inside the mita areas, people are much more likely to be producing for subsistence and not engaging in markets, and that's the proximate reason why they are poorer today. So my hypothesis is that the long-term presence of large landowners in the non-mita districts provided a stable land tenure system that encouraged economic production and public goods provision. In this context, the alternative to the large landowners was not small and franchise landowners of the type you might see, say, in New England and the US, but rather, the institutional structures did not respect the rights of people living in the mita areas, so the alternative to these large landowners was poorly defined property rights and an under-provision of public goods. So clearly the non-mita districts were not organized for the benefit of the masses, and yet the landowners there did provide a stabilizing force, and they were able to get public goods that continued to benefit the population even long after the land reform, now that the large landowners are gone. Okay, so that's one example of an extractive institution, and then I want to contrast this to a second example that I've looked at, which is the cultivation system in Indonesia. And as I've just shown you, the extractive colonizers plausibly set up weak institutions with poor property rights protection, and that can affect development in the long run. However, at the same time, in many contexts to extract a surplus from the colonies, the colonizers had to set up new economic systems that would create that surplus. In many of the colonies, people were mostly subsistence farmers, etc. And in order to have a surplus that they could extract, the colonizers had to go in and reorganize economic activity. And so we look at this in the context of the Dutch cultivation system in Java. The island of Java was the center of the Dutch colonial empire, and even today it has a population of over 160 million people, and so it's economically, in terms of population, it's a very important region. And from the 1830s through the 1870s, the Dutch colonial state forced peasants along Java's northern coast to cultivate sugar, which was then processed nearby and exported to Europe. And the revenues of this system at their peak accounted for 1/3 of Dutch government revenue, about 5% of Dutch GDP. So this was, in an economic sense, it was the most, the largest example of colonial extraction that we see in a financial sense. Sugar production in Indonesia collapsed during the Great Depression, and today Indonesia doesn't produce much sugar. It's the world's largest sugar importer. So sugar production today is not going to be the driver of the effects that I show you. So sugar, when you harvest it, it's very heavy and it spoils very quickly, and so you need to process it nearby. And the Dutch established 94 water-powered sugar processing factories, and then they grew the sugar cane in a radius around each factory. So in order to do this, they also had to reorganize these villages and empower local officials to make sure that the cane was produced. The Dutch people were mostly in the cities, and it was actually the village elites who were making sure that sugar got produced. They had to receive sort of incentives to do that. Reports from the 1860s show that over 2.5 million forced workers had labored in sugar factories or in related services, and they were joined by free labor in the factories as time went on. So we look at two different types of impacts, which could, in theory, be quite distinct. We look at the effects of creating these sugar processing factories, which had to be located near where the sugar was cultivated. And we also look at the effects of subjecting the villages around each factory to forced sugar cultivation. And how are we able to do this empirically? Well, first of all, to look at the impacts of the sugar factories, we exploit the fact that these catchment areas were often adjacent. So you'd put a factory, and you'd have the area around it grow sugar, and then you put the next factory up the river just far enough so that it had enough land around it to grow sugar, and so forth. So if you move one of the factories up the river 1 kilometer, you're going to have to shift all the other factories up 1 kilometer, because each factory needs enough land around it that it can produce enough cane to be working at capacity. So we're going to use this, the fact that there's many potential equilibria for where you could place the factories for identification. So we can estimate the effects of being close to an actual factory using highly disaggregated data. And then we compare these effects to the distribution of estimated effects of being near plausible counterfactual factory sites, where we use geospatial information systems to identify counterfactual sites using 2 criteria. They must be along the same rivers as the actual factories, and they must have enough sugar-suitable land around them that they can produce the cane. So this is just an illustration. You see here an actual factory in green that's located along a river. And in red, there's a potential counterfactual factory location that also has sugar-suitable land along it, along the same river. And these are all the different potential locations where this factory could be located. And then, we create different equilibria factory configurations, making sure that the factories in each configuration are sufficiently far apart. In terms of estimating the effects of being forced to cultivate the sugarcane, we match all the over 10,000 villages that were subjected to this system with villages today, so we know exactly where the boundaries of these catchment areas are, and then we just compare on either side, just like I showed you in the previous paper. And this allows us to control for anything that changes smoothly, including distance to the factories. So this is just a picture of the areas that were subjected to forced sugarcane cultivation. So the results are as follows. When we look at the impact of the sugar factories themselves, we find that people living within a few kilometers of historical sugar factories are much less likely to be employed in agriculture and more likely to be employed in manufacturing in 1980 and also more recently. If we look in the immediate vicinity of the historical factories, we in particular see more employment in industries that are downstream from sugar production. So processed sugar is added to all different kinds of processed food, right? Everything tastes better with sugar. And so you see around these sugar factories, lots of other food processing establishments locate there, even though by and large sugar is no longer produced in these places. Moreover, in close proximity to the historical factories, there's more infrastructure. Historically, the Dutch had to build roads and railroads to transport the processed sugar to the ports, and those have had persistent effects on the location of infrastructure and also on the location of schools. And finally, household consumption is higher. So I'll just quickly illustrate this with a series of graphs. So each of these on the horizontal axis, this is a distance to the factory, so 2, 4, 6, 8 kilometers away from the factory and so forth. And then the effect is shown on the y-axis. So you can see that places in the immediate vicinity of the factories are less agricultural today. By the time you get to 6 or 7 kilometers away, those effects are gone. We see the same thing in 1980. The converse of that is that places in the immediate vicinity of the factory have more manufacturing, both today and historically, and they also have more retail. And they're more dense in terms of their population, so they're more likely to be urban areas. We can look at sugar processing itself. So when we include the places in the sample that have a modern sugar factory, right there you see in that bin right next to the historical factory, they're more likely to process sugar today. But we can drop those places from a sample, and we do that for the rest of the results. Today, sugarcane by and large isn't grown in these areas any longer. So this is looking at sectors that are upstream from sugar, like machinery that's used in sugar production, farm machinery, etc. When we look at the full sample, there's much more of these industries near the actual factories, but that's not the case when we draw places with the modern sugar factories. However, when we look at downstream industries, so mostly other forms of food processing, this relationship remains there even when we drop all the places that have a modern sugar factory. So today, you see industries that use sugar clustered around the historical sugar factories, even though most of those factories had disappeared by the 1930s. You also see more infrastructure in these places historically. They got more roads and railroads in 1900. They have still more roads today. Basically, the infrastructure that Indonesia has today is what the Dutch built historically. You see more schools in the immediate vicinity of the factories, and you see more education looking across different cohorts, including the cohort that was educated during the Dutch period, which is the black line there. And household consumption is higher. Okay, so that's the effects of being close to the factories. Creating the sugar processing infrastructure made places nearby more industrialized and richer in the long run. We can also look at the impacts of being forced to grow sugar cane. And what we see in particular is that both historically and today, subjected villages have more village-owned land. And the historical reason for that is that in order to sort of share the burdens of the system and to help to organize the forced labor, villages that were subjected to forced cultivation converted much of their land into village-owned land, and they still have more village-owned land today. The proceeds of that village-owned land historically were used to provide education. Today they're used to pay village heads. So we see that educational attainment is modestly higher in subjected villages for cohorts educated both before and after independence, and they also have the potential to potentially attract better village heads, as work by Monica Martinez Bravo shows that when you have more educated village heads, they're better at providing public goods more generally. And a greater percentage of households in the subjected villages work in manufacturing, a lower percentage in agriculture. And so our interpretation of these results is as follows. If you look at rural Java in 1830, it's a heavily agricultural economy governed by feudal-like labor norms. There's not much of a potential for industrialization. The Dutch, they don't have benevolent motives. They want to extract as much as they possibly can, but the way that they go about doing that is to implement these economic changes that lead to a more modern economy. There's more manufacturing and retail, greater education levels near the historical factories and also in the subjected villages. And I should say that the Dutch were not unique in trying to go in and modernize the economy so that they could extract a surplus. For example, the Japanese did something similar in Taiwan. The British, to an extent, did something similar in India. And these economic changes are highly persistent even long after the Dutch have left. Indonesians have been very innovative in taking advantage of these colonial economic structures to continue to generate economic output today. So we can step back and ask, well, why do we see different effects? I'm also going to talk in this a little bit about a paper by Lowe's and Montero that looks at rubber in the DRC. They find that the extractive system that the Belgians use to extract rubber from the DRC has very negative long-run effects on economic outcomes. And in understanding why these different types of extractive institutions generate different results, I'm going to emphasize two factors: the role of manufacturing and investments in infrastructure, and argue that these are particularly important channels of persistence. So the cultivation system required substantial local manufacturing in order to process sugar cane, whereas the Mita, there was just silver in one location. Conscripts had to march there from their communities, and there wasn't any sort of processing that came along with that. There was likewise very little processing that came along with rubber. And the linkages between sugar and other sectors plausibly provided a key mechanism for the propagation of industrialization, which was an idea emphasized by those development economists in the 1940s and 50s that I was initially talking about in the presentation. The infrastructure investments are also quite important because you had sugar processed all across the north coast of Java. The Dutch built a very dense road and rail network that you don't see that happen in the Peruvian case, and actually later on the infrastructure goes outside the Mita areas. And likewise, the Belgians just tried to extract as much as quickly as they could and didn't build much infrastructure. So these are potentially two channels of persistence that play a major role in determining how these historical institutions, which are clearly probably very bad for the subjective populations historically, but don't necessarily have negative long-run effects. The long-run effects can even be positive, in contexts where, in order to extract a surplus, the economy was modernized. Okay, I want to just briefly mention a second important point that has come out of the literature over the past decade, which is that informal norms can also be very important in generating persistence. So in the above examples, I emphasize things like infrastructure and agglomeration, and yet persistence is not limited to these sort of more classic mechanisms. Norms of behavior that can be transmitted within communities or transmitted within families are likewise potentially important in generating persistence. And a large literature in recent years has examined the role that they play in long-run development. So I'm going to talk about one particular example from my research, which is about the role of local collective action norms in East Asian development. And these norms were initially inspired by the historical state in East Asia. And so our motivating sort of question that we wanted to better understand is that there's been a large divergence in economic prosperity within Asia over the past century. Places that all started out poor, some like Japan, Taiwan, South Korea became very rich. Other places, mostly in Southeast Asia, like the Philippines, etc., remained quite poor. And Vietnam is unique in that it had two very different historical polities that were contained within a single modern country. And so we want to test this idea in the literature that part of why Northeast Asia was successful historically is it had a very different type of state than Southeast Asia. It's really hard to compare South Korea to the Philippines because so many things are different. But within Vietnam, part of Vietnam was governed by a Northeast Asian style of state, part was governed by a Southeast Asian style of state, so we can make the comparison holding more things constant. So specifically, northern Vietnam was ruled by a bureaucratic state inherited from China, whereas the south of Vietnam was a peripheral part of the Cambodian Empire that was not brought under the control of Vietnam until just prior to French colonization. And I want to compare very explicitly these two historical states. So in the Dai Viet, the Vietnamese state was a part of China. It maintained bureaucratic Chinese government system after independence. It imposed an impersonalized, centralized bureaucracy, a dynastic court, uniform territorial administration, Importantly, the central state set quotas for local taxation and military recruitment and regulated property norms, but it was the village chiefs and elected village councils who were actually responsible for determining how to meet these quotas. So the central state said you need to provide so many taxes and military conscripts, but we're going to let you as a village decide together how to do that. Whereas in the Khmer, the Southeast Asian style of state, it's what historians have called a patron-client state. It's essentially dominated by large landowners who have attached peasants, and they pay tribute sort of up the chain based on what's called a temple-based system of public finance. So a large landowner would build a temple, and then the peasants had to bring tribute to that temple, and the landowner would pass part of that tribute up the chain to higher levels of government. It's very personalized, and importantly, there's no village structure to speak of. As a peasant, you're attached to a particular landlord, and that's your form of social relation. The village does not play an important role in providing public goods or in any form of governance. So this is going to be very important to the effects that we find. In the places that were controlled by Dai Viet, they have a history going back hundreds of years of having to work together as a village to provide public goods and to meet impositions set by the central government, whereas the places that were part of the Khmer state, they don't have that sort of experience. Like right after they joined Vietnam, Vietnam was conquered by the French, who largely kind of left things as they were beforehand and didn't try to actually bring in the Khmer places and make them more like the places that have been part of Vietnam for a long time. And so we're just going to compare across this boundary. On the east of the boundary, these places were part of Vietnam for 150 years prior to the French showing up, whereas on the west side of the boundary, they only joined Vietnam right before the French came. And we're just going to compare across that boundary to think about how the historical state matters in the long run. And we find, first of all, that the places that were part of the historical state, the Vietnamese historical state, for much longer have higher living standards, both today and historically. And in particular, in these villages, citizens have been much better able to organize for public goods provision through local government and civil society, particularly following a constitutional reform that emphasized participatory governance. So during the 1960s, the US came in and encouraged Vietnam to reform its constitution and give villages kind of the right to govern themselves. Most public goods provision is happening at the village level. That's really where the action is. In places that had a long history of organizing as a village, villages do a very good job of providing public goods, whereas in places where they don't have that history, that doesn't happen, and they struggle to provide public goods. Villages with a long history of working together as a village to provide public goods also have a stronger civil society. A final point that is interesting, though, is that a strong historical state and certain formal institutions actually appear to be substitutes. And the villages that were part of Vietnam for a much longer period historically, there's a lower use of formal land titles. That's true in the 1960s, and it's true today, and there's a lower use of financial instruments, in some sense because they have very high levels of social capital within the village, and formal mechanisms of providing credit, insurance, etc. work much better, and the formal sector, which is formal financial sector, formal land titles, which are relatively recent innovation in Vietnam, haven't been adopted to the same extent. So our interpretation is places with a long history of organizing as a village through both government and civil society are also better at organizing as a village more recently. So if you think about reforms where there's decentralization with participatory governance, this is a favored reform of places like the World Bank. Those are going to work best in places that have a history of village government, that have a history of working together. In places that don't have that history, it's going to be more of a challenge to get those off the ground, and it's important to take that into account. However, the presence of a strong local state does not necessarily imply that formal, impersonal institutions will necessarily be more developed. In some sense, having a stronger local state, higher local social capital can actually be a substitute for those formal institutions, which is different than what we see in Europe. And finally, the historical state can potentially have a substantial impact on current development and could be plausibly important in explaining the divergence between Northeast and Southeast Asia more generally. And there's anecdotal evidence that this may have been important for Japan's takeoff, etc. as well. So I'll just finally mention another example, a paper by Lowe's et al. That looks at a similar question. They're looking at a historical state in the Congo, but they ask a different question, which is how does it affect norms of behavior that are transmitted within families, and in particular norms of cheating. And so they look at people who are today living in the same city, but their families came from different places. Some had families that were part of this historical state, their ancestors lived there, some didn't, and they find very persistent effects in this context as well. So these historical norms, in our case, transmission through communities is important. They can also be transmitted through families, and both studies support a nascent literature arguing that culture and institutions evolve together to generate persistent economic patterns. Okay. So I finally want to talk briefly about future directions, places that I'm particularly excited about, where I think that the field is going in the next decade. And so today, I think there's widespread consensus that understanding mechanisms of persistence is important. And the literature is largely of the flavor, there was this historical event that happened, it still matters today, let's think about why. But the treatment of richer dynamics of persistence and transformation is much more limited. So there's a whole series of important questions. What factors promote economic takeoff? So people have thought about this a lot in the context of Europe, what led to the Industrial Revolution. People haven't done nearly as much work to understand more recent examples of takeoff. For example, in East Asia, what allowed South Korea or Taiwan or Singapore to start out initially quite poor and then grow very rapidly. More generally, what forces lead to convergence and potentially even reversal? And what's the role for institutional leapfrogging? So let me explain a little bit more what I mean by that in a minute. How do historical forces interact with modern reforms? So let me just say a word more about institutional leapfrogging. And so a motivating example for this is the case of Venice, which was very economically successful in the medieval times. It was sort of a center of Europe, and yet this wasn't where the Industrial Revolution and modern economic growth happened. And some historians have argued that Venice's institutions were very well adapted to the medieval period. They were very successful. And when the world changed, they didn't innovate. They had their ways and they stuck with them, and that eventually led them to become less successful economically. So we potentially see a similar phenomenon in Vietnam, where these places that I talked about that have higher social capital and hence are richer today, they haven't taken as much advantage in recent years of foreign direct investment, which has been important to economic growth in the most recent time. So it's interesting to think, could this historical advantage that helped you to be successful relative to your neighbors for a long time, when the world changes, can that actually hold you back because you're not as able to be flexible? You think you've done a great job and things are working, and you're less willing to change with circumstances. So I think thinking more about this is potentially important. And so how are we going to sort of develop these richer insights into persistence? There's several different areas of current advancement that I think are going to be really useful for thinking about more complex dynamics of persistence and change. So the first is the use of machine learning to unlock rich sources of historical data. Also expansion beyond the traditional context, and finally greater synergies with other frontiers in social science. So let me say a little bit more about each of these. So one of the challenges of documenting more complex patterns of persistence is that if you don't have really good, rich data, you'll have very large standard errors. So maybe you can say that something has an effect in 1950 and 1970 and today, but you don't have enough statistical power to say, are those effects different? What are the dynamics over time? So really, to look into richer patterns of persistence, it's important to have very good data. And in fact, there is quite a bit of very good historical data that exists, but it has traditionally been just very costly to digitize it. If you have to hire somebody to sit there and type everything in, the cost can just be prohibitive. Whereas accessing richer data, if you can teach the computer to read those historical documents, it has the potential to just unlock a vast amount of historical data that would have been too costly to look at. And I think we're right now at a time where the computer is just now getting good enough that it can do that rather than having to type everything in by hand. So let me give a few examples of applications of machine learning. So one example that's probably the best developed is just linking historical microdata, taking people in one census in 1920 and finding them in the 1930 census. We can also just automate the digitization of data in areas where traditionally optimal character recognition has performed poorly. You can imagine using natural language processing to extract data or to extract other information, like about sentiment from text. Or you could imagine using image processing to extract information from historical aerial photography. So the US military took very detailed pictures all over the world back in the 50s and 60s, and those pictures are all sitting there in the National Archives. People use satellite data today to extract economic information. You could imagine using something similar with computer vision and all these very detailed pictures that were taken historically to extract information about economic development historically. So I'll just give one example from a paper in progress that I'm working on, which is looking at the role of managerial capital in economic development. And so I don't want to go too much into the details of this project, but just give this as an example of how useful machine learning can be. So essentially, we're looking at an economic purge in Japan that was implemented by the occupying authorities after World War II. Douglas MacArthur decided that any firm with a market capitalization of over 100 million yen, their managers would be removed, and they would no longer be allowed to work at large firms, but they could go to small firms. And the reason why he did this is that he held large firms largely responsible for the militarization of Japan. So there's a lot of anecdotes about this. One person who was purged moved to Sony, which at the time had 6 employees in the basement of a Tokyo department store, and it's argued that his connections were largely responsible for Sony's rise. So today you could imagine if for some reason the US government told Jeff Bezos, well, you can't work at Amazon anymore, but you can go work at a startup. And so this is a really unique sort of natural experiment to look at the role of managerial capital in development. And in order to do this, we need to be able to track where the managers move to over time. So this is just showing that there's indeed this sharp discontinuity in whether or not a manager was purged at this cutoff. And in order to find these managers over time, we use detailed personnel records from the Japanese economy that starting in the 1920s, they list the managers of all firms, both publicly traded and limited liability corporations in Japan. But the problem is you can see that these are pretty messy, right? And there are names here and they all have to be extracted and they're not in nice columns that go straight across. And so, traditional OCR software doesn't really like this and will kind of mess it up. But we've been working on using machine learning to get this to digitize correctly. And this is in a form of Japanese that uses Chinese characters, and then we need to match it with this, which is the form of Japanese that uses Romanized characters. That's what the occupation authorities use to list the purged individuals in this particular company. If we had to do this all by hand, it wouldn't be feasible because there's thousands and thousands of personnel records for the Japanese economy across time. But by using the computer, we can make the process of actually, digitizing all of this feasible, because once a computer can do something well, it's much, much, much faster than humans. Okay, a second point I want to make is opening up new contexts. Like much of economics, economic history has traditionally focused on the US and Europe. Much of the work on long-run development has focused on former European colonies, and that's really just because of the language constraints, it's more feasible, but actually some of the world's richest data is from places like, colonial Taiwan, which was a colony of Japan. Incredibly rich data. It's a context you'd think we'd really want to understand because it's one of the best examples of rapid economic growth that we see, and so all that data is there, yet it just hasn't been exploited. But as the field of economics becomes more and more diverse, and we get economists from all over the world who are very active in looking at these questions, it will unlock a lot of new promising contexts. And so some examples, Japan historically, British India. During the Cold War, the US collected a lot of data, the military especially, and that's another particularly rich source of data that's been largely underexploited. And then the final point I want to make is that it's very important to integrate with other frontiers in economics, ranging from evolutionary psychology, which can help us to think about how norms of behavior persist across time, about the role of the family in development, political economy, using network models to conceptualize topics that could range from, the propagation of structural change to the transmission of social norms, thinking about crime, thinking about all kinds of different questions. Advances that are being made in thinking about different types of networks, including social networks, I think have the potential to contribute a huge amount to thinking about development and persistence in the long run. Okay, so just to conclude, I've argued that understanding history is incredibly important for thinking about development in the long run. And the literature to date has largely focused on establishing, first of all, that history matters, which is something that economists, for whatever reason, didn't really quite appreciate historically. And beyond that, providing some insights on why history matters. What are the mechanisms of persistence? How can we use those to think about broader models of persistence and change? So moving forward, I think that innovations in various areas, ranging from machine learning to regional studies to the economics of networks, has the potential to unlock significant new insights into richer patterns of persistence and transformation. Thank you.
Melissa, do you mind to entertain some questions?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So if there are any.
Was there a question?
Yes.
Oh.
You need yours.
Yeah, I can use
Maybe
it.
you can use one on the
Yeah,
table?
not a problem.
Yeah. Great, thanks.
Melissa, on the issue of pre-colonial institutions and the influence of pre-colonial institutions, we are going backward, even further than colonial institutions and going to the, era, the primitive eras, no? But in the case of META, for example, that seems to be something that was there already before the Spaniards arrived there, even though it was not called, the formation, the formal institution was with the Spanish arrived. So how is it possible to separate, these pre-colonial institutions that give rise to the possibility that the colonial new governments, form these new institutions from, the things that were there already and, precede these institutions?
Yeah, so I think that that's a great point, and oftentimes the reason it's not working.
Yeah, you just have to put.
Okay, I think I'll leave this out here, so the next person who has a question. Okay, and so I think that that's a great point. Oftentimes the reason why colonizers were able to implement certain institutions was that there was already a history of that. If you take nomadic populations, for example, it was very difficult to exploit them because they just didn't, have a structure that the colonists could come in and take over the top layer of. That said, with the specific example of the mita, so indigenous populations also had something that they called a mita, but it functioned quite differently. So individuals had to work within their communities to maintain irrigation works, etc. So it didn't involve marching to Potosi or moving outside the community, and it was to provide public goods within their community that benefited the community. Importantly, for my empirical strategy, the mita that was there in the pre-colonial period, which involved individuals working in their community, that happened everywhere. So it doesn't change at the boundary that I exploit. So I'm comparing two places that are nearby. They both had the pre-colonial mita, but only one of them had the mining mita. And so that's how I'm able to control for that. Of course, it would be a fascinating question to look at the impacts of these pre-colonial institutions, but in this particular case, what I'm doing is holding them constant.
Any more questions? Thank you.
Thank
Thank you very
you.
much.